Why would someone knock once and vanish? I'm 63 today, and the morning feels like any other, the kind of ordinary that settled into my bones since Ezra stopped speaking to me 3 years ago. My name is Marlene Graves, and I live alone in a small house with a porch swing that creaks under my weight and a lawn that refuses to stay green, no matter how much I coax it with water. The quiet wraps around me, familiar as the black coffee cooling in my mug. The crossword puzzle half finished on the table, its squares a distraction from the ache of silence. Ezra's absence has carved a hollow space, not just in my days, but in the way I move through them, careful, like I'm avoiding a bruise. The knock came mid-morning, sharp and singular, followed by the crunch of footsteps retreating down the gravel path. Not the mailman's impatient tap or the neighbor kid hawking fundraiser coupons, just one deliberate sound, then nothing. I shuffled to the door, barefoot on the worn doormat, and found a box waiting. Plain brown paper, meticulously taped, a thin blue ribbon tied once around its middle like it was holding its breath. The handwriting stopped me cold. Ezra's. I'd know it anywhere, even after 3 years. Precise, blueprint neat, no wasted curves, always in blue ink. Marlene Graves, it read, and I whispered my name under my breath, testing if it sounded different coming from him. I didn't open it right away. My fingers hovered, the ribbon smooth against my skin, as if touching it might unravel something I wasn't ready for. 3 years of silence. No card when pneumonia had me coughing through the night. No call when my sister slipped away in her sleep. Now this. A package on my birthday, like a question I didn't ask. Inside, I set it on the kitchen table, the wood grain catching the morning light. The coffee had gone cold, so I reheated it, the microwave's hum filling the quiet. I sat, folding my hands in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting to be called on. The box sat there, patient, its ribbon gleaming faintly. Curiosity tugged, but so did something heavier, doubt, maybe, or the weight of all those unspoken years. When I finally cut the ribbon, the paper fell away to reveal a white box, and inside, nestled in tissue like fragile keepsakes, were cookies. Dozens of them, each one different, carefully iced, blue flowers, golden leaves, stars dusted with sugar that caught the light like frost. Handmade, precise, beautiful. Ezra had never baked a day in his life. A small card was taped to the lid's underside. "Happy birthday, Mom, let's start over." I held it, my throat tightening, not a lump, just a soft ache, like wanting something to be real but not trusting it yet. I read it again, tracing the blue ink, his handwriting steady as ever. My chest felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down. I didn't eat the cookies. I wanted to taste the sweetness of that note, but something held me back. Pride? Maybe. Or fear. Or something quieter, a whisper I couldn't name but didn't want to ignore. I slipped one cookie, a star, its edges sharp as a draftsman's line, into a small Tupperware container and sealed it in the fridge. The rest I rewrapped, the tissue crinkling softly. Ruth Langford came to mind. Ezra's mother-in-law, always kind, especially when Ezra pulled away. She lived just 15 minutes down the road, her house tucked among trees that glowed orange in the late afternoon sun. I drove over, the box on the passenger seat, the ribbon loose now, curling like a question mark. Ruth's wind chimes danced as I handed her the box, brushing off her protests with a smile. "You'll enjoy these more than me," I said, and she laughed, her eyes crinkling. Driving home, the empty passenger seat felt lighter, but the relief was thin, like paper stretched too tight. Back in the kitchen, I stood in the doorway, staring at the table's empty spot where the box had been. The house creaked around me, and I tried not to notice how the silence felt sharper now, like it was waiting for something to break it. That evening, the house seemed to settle differently, the creaks in the floorboards echoing a little longer as I moved through the rooms. I poured myself a glass of water, the tap running cold and clear, but my mind kept drifting back to the box, to the way the cookies had looked so innocent, so carefully made. I hadn't planned to give them away at first. When I opened the package, the scent of sugar and vanilla had wafted up. Faint but inviting, stirring something nostalgic in me, like the afternoons I'd bake for Ezra when he was small, his face lighting up at the first warm bite. But that memory soured quickly, tangled with the years of distance. Why now? After all this time, what did "let's start over" really mean? I stood at the kitchen counter, the card in my hand again, its edges sharp against my palm. The ache in my throat returned, softer this time, mixed with a wariness I couldn't shake. I decided then, staring at the rewrapped box, that I wouldn't taste them. Not yet. Maybe it was the pride that had built up over 3 years, a wall against the hurt of his silence, or perhaps a deeper instinct, like the way animals sense a storm before the clouds gather. I selected one cookie carefully, a small round one with blue icing swirled like a forget-me-not, and tucked it into the Tupperware, sealing it with a snap that sounded too final in the quiet kitchen. The fridge hummed as I placed it on the shelf, next to the half-empty jar of jam and the wilted lettuce I'd meant to throw out. It felt like preserving a piece of the puzzle, something sweet for later, or maybe just proof that the package had been real. The rest I left in the box, the tissue paper rustling as I tied the ribbon back on, looser this time. Ruth's house was a short drive, the road winding through neighborhoods where kids played in yards and dogs barked at passing cars. I hadn't seen her in months, but she'd always been a steady presence, even after Ezra married Laya and the family ties stretched thin. She answered the door with a warm smile, her apron dusted with flour from whatever she'd been baking herself. Ironic, I thought, as I handed over the box. "From Ezra," I said lightly, waving off her questions. "He sent them for my birthday, but you know me and sweets these days. Thought you'd appreciate them more." She protested at first, her hands fluttering like birds, but her eyes lit up when she peeked inside. "They're beautiful," she murmured, tracing a finger over a golden leaf. We chatted on her porch for a bit, the wind chimes tinkling softly, talking about the weather and her garden, how the roses were fighting off aphids again. It felt normal, grounding, a small act of kindness in a day that had tilted off balance. As I drove away, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the trees, a weight lifted from my chest. The box was gone, the decision made, no more staring at it on the table, wondering. But relief has a way of fraying at the edges. Back home, I busied myself with dinner, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, the knife's rhythm steady against the cutting board. The kitchen smelled of onions and garlic, comforting, but my thoughts kept circling back. Ezra baking? It didn't fit. He'd always been precise, yes, folding his clothes into perfect squares, aligning his books by spine color. But creative like this? No. I remembered a Christmas when he was 15, refusing my homemade pie because the crust wasn't even, his face tight with disapproval. "It's not right," he'd said, pushing the plate away. I'd laughed it off then, called it his perfectionism, but now it nagged, a thread pulling loose. The evening stretched on, the TV murmuring in the living room as I sat with a book I wasn't reading, the pages blurring. The porch swing creaked outside, empty, and I wondered if giving the cookies away had been a mistake, like handing over a piece of him without understanding why he'd sent it. By bedtime, the unease had settled in, quiet but insistent, like a draft slipping under the door. I checked the locks twice, something I hadn't done in years, and lay awake staring at the ceiling fan's slow spin. The card was on my nightstand, its words glowing faintly in the lamplight. "Let's start over." What did that mean for us? Forgiveness? Or something else, hidden in the sugar and icing? Sleep came fitfully, dreams fragmented with images of blue ink and crumbling dough. When morning light filtered through the curtains, I rose early, the floor cold under my feet. I poured coffee, the steam rising like a sigh, and halfway through my second cup, the phone rang. The sound jolted me, sharp in the stillness. It's been ages since anyone called this early, longer still since that number appeared on the screen. Ezra. My hand hovered, the mug warm in my grip, before I picked up. "Hello? Hi, Mom." His voice slid through, smooth and casual, as if 3 years hadn't piled up like unread letters between us. "Happy birthday. A little late, I know." I sat down slowly, the chair scraping against the tile. "Ezra, I got your package." "Yeah," a soft chuckle, easy. "Wasn't sure you would, wasn't sure you'd open it, honestly." I did. It was unexpected. Silence stretched, thin as wire. Then, too casually, "So how were they? The cookies?" I took a breath, the coffee bitter on my tongue. "Oh, I didn't eat them. I gave them to Ruth." The line went quiet, dead as a dropped signal. I checked the phone, but the call held. "You gave them to Ruth?" His tone shifted, sharper now, the warmth draining away like water from a cracked cup. "Yes," I said slowly. "She's always loved sweets, and I didn't know what to do with them." He didn't respond right away. I heard his breathing, tight and uneven. Then, quietly at first, building, "You did what?" The words landed hard, a slap through the receiver. I blinked, stunned. "Ezra, what's wrong?" "They weren't for her," he snapped. "They were for you. Only you." His voice cracked, not sadness but frustration. Panic, maybe. I couldn't pin it. Frozen, the mug cooling in my hands, I murmured, "I didn't know." "Right, of course you didn't." Bitterness seeped in, thick. "You never do." He hung up, the dial tone humming like an accusation. I set the phone down, staring at the counter, my heart thudding deep, insistent. "Only you." The words echoed, chilling now. What had I missed? I stood there in the kitchen, the phone still warm in my hand from where I'd set it down, the dial tone's echo fading like a bad dream. Ezra's words hung in the air. "Only you." Twisting something inside me. A knot I hadn't felt in years. What had he meant by that? The sharpness in his voice, the way it cracked like thin ice underfoot, it wasn't just anger. It was something raw, exposed, like a nerve I'd accidentally brushed. I walked to the fridge, my slippers whispering against the linoleum, and opened the door. The light spilled out, cool and harsh, illuminating the Tupperware container where the single cookie sat, untouched, its icing still perfect. I stared at it, the sugar crystals winking mockingly, and a chill crept up my arms despite the morning warmth seeping through the window. Why had I saved it? A small kindness to myself, I'd thought yesterday, but now it felt like evidence of something unspoken, a warning I hadn't heeded. I shut the fridge harder than I meant to, the jars rattling inside, and leaned against the counter, suddenly cold. My heart thudded not fast, but deep, insistent, like it wanted to be heard over the rush of thoughts crowding my mind. 3 years of silence, and now this. A package, a call, and anger that flared like a match struck in the dark. I replayed the conversation in my head, his casual chuckle at first, smooth as polished stone, then the shift when I mentioned Ruth. They weren't for her. The bitterness in those words, thick and choking, like smoke from a fire I didn't start. Had I misread the gesture? The card said, "Let's start over." But maybe it wasn't an olive branch. Maybe it was a hook, baited with sweetness to pull me in. I folded my arms, hugging myself, the fabric of my robe soft but offering no comfort. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking seconds that stretched too long. Memories surfaced unbidden, bubbling up like water from a cracked pipe. Ezra at 6, his small hands arranging his toys in rigid lines, screaming if I moved one out of place. "It's wrong, Mom," he'd say, his face red, eyes wide with a fury that seemed too big for his body. I'd soothed him then, called it his way of making sense of the world, but there were other times. Darker ones I'd pushed down. Like when he was 13 and I forgot to buy his favorite cereal, the one with the exact right crunch. He didn't yell, he went quiet, watching me eat my breakfast the next day with eyes that burned. Later, the box appeared in the trash, crushed as if punishing it for my mistake. Quirks, I'd told myself. He's just particular. But now, in the light of that call, those quirks felt like shadows, lengthening into something more sinister. Had he always held grudges like this, filing them away to sharpen later? The package, the cookies. So precise, so him. Baking wasn't his thing, but control was. I moved to the window, parting the curtains to look out at the yard. The lawn mocked me, patches of brown defiant against the green I'd tried to nurture. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance, a normal sound that felt intrusive now. What if the cookies were a test? Eat them, prove I trusted him, start over on his terms. But I hadn't. And his reaction? Panic, almost. Frustration laced with something desperate. I rubbed my temples, a headache blooming behind my eyes, the coffee's bitterness lingering on my tongue. Maybe I was overthinking it. Age does that. Turns whispers into shouts. At 63, I'd learned to live with the quiet, the lonely comfort of routine, but this disrupted it all. I whispered his name, Ezra, like saying it might summon an explanation. The air felt heavier, charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath. To shake it off, I busied my hands, rinsing the mug in the sink, the water hot against my skin. Suds formed and popped, fragile as hopes. Perhaps I should call him back, smooth things over, but my fingers hesitated over the phone. What would I say? Sorry for sharing your gift? It sounded absurd, petty. No, better to let it sit, like dough rising, see what shape it took. But the confusion gnawed, a quiet erosion. Why cookies? Why now? The ribbon, the careful icing, it all screamed intention. But what kind? I dried my hands on a towel, folding it neatly out of habit, and wandered into the living room. Dust motes danced in the sunlight slanting through the blinds, and I picked up a framed photo from the shelf. Ezra at graduation, his smile tight, eyes distant even then. I'd been proud, beaming beside him, but looking back there was a wall there, invisible but solid. The afternoon dragged, the sun climbing higher, casting that soft orange glow across the trees outside. I tried the crossword again, but the clues blurred, my mind elsewhere. Only you. It echoed like a refrain, chilling in its possessiveness. Had he meant it as a plea or a threat? I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty settled like sediment in my chest. I paced the hallway, the floorboards creaking underfoot, each step a question without answer. Maybe Ruth had eaten them by now, savored the sweetness I'd passed on. The thought brought a fleeting smile. Her delight, at least, was real. But underneath, doubt stirred, quiet but persistent. What if giving them away had been a mistake, not just for me, but for her? Nonsense, I told myself, shaking my head. Cookies couldn't carry that much weight. Yet as the light faded, leaving the room in a dull haze, I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't turn on the lamps, letting the shadows lengthen. Later, aimless, I headed back to the kitchen, instinct pulling me toward order. I wiped counters that were already clean, folded towels that didn't need it. Opening the trash to empty it, my hand paused. There, near the bottom, a small clear plastic bottle, like for vitamins. No label, just a faint ring of white powder inside. I fished it out, turning it in my fingers. It wasn't mine, hadn't been there before. The cap tight, the residue powdery, innocent-looking. My pulse quickened. Where had it come from? The package, maybe, or something else? I set it on the counter, staring as if it might explain itself. That's when the other phone rang, the landline in the hallway, crackling like it had forgotten how to work. Almost no one used it anymore. Dread spread, slow and cold, as I walked toward it. The landline's ring pierced the dim hallway, insistent and unfamiliar, like a voice from another time. I hesitated, my hand still clutching the small plastic bottle I'd pulled from the trash. Its surface cool and slightly gritty with residue. The powder inside clung to the walls, faint and white, harmless looking but out of place in my orderly kitchen. I set it down on the hall table, the clink echoing softly, and picked up the receiver. It crackled in my ear, static hissing before a voice came through. Marlene? It was Leah, Ezra's wife, her tone strained, brittle as dry leaves. Yes? I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The dread that had been pooling in my stomach now rose, sharp and cold. It's Ruth, she's in the hospital. I sat down without thinking, the chair in the hallway creaking under me, my knees suddenly weak. What happened? Leah's words tumbled out, fragmented, like she was piecing them together herself. Ruth had collapsed that morning, vomiting, disoriented, unable to stand. At first, they thought it was the flu, something simple, but it worsened quickly, her confusion deepening, her skin pale and clammy. The ER was running tests, but nothing definitive yet. My mouth went dry, the bottle on the table catching my eye, its emptiness mocking. Did she eat anything unusual? I asked, the words careful, probing. A pause on the line, hospital noises filtering through, beeps from monitors, heels clicking on tile, a cart squeaking down a hall. She mentioned cookies, Leah said finally. Said you brought them over. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I did. I gave her the box Ezra sent me. Silence again, heavier this time, charged with unspoken questions. Do you think they could have made her sick? She asked, her voice small, edged with fear. I don't know, I whispered, though doubt gnawed at me, insistent as a splinter. I didn't eat any myself. Another pause, the line humming between us. If you think of anything at all, you'll tell me? Yes, I said. Of course. We hung up, and I sat there in the fading light, staring at the wall where shadows stretched long and thin. The afternoon sun had dipped, leaving the living room in a dull haze, and I didn't move for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to name. Ruth in the hospital. Kind, steady Ruth, who had welcomed me with tea and sympathy when Ezra first distanced himself, blaming me for slights I couldn't recall. And now this, tied to the cookies I'd handed over so casually. My hands trembled as I picked up the bottle again, turning it under the lamp's glow. No label, no markings, just that faint powder ring, like dust from a forgotten shelf. It wasn't mine. I kept my vitamins in the cabinet, labeled neatly. How had it gotten in the trash? The package, maybe something hidden in the tissue, discarded without thought, or worse, planted? The idea slithered in, cold and unwelcome, linking to Ezra's anger on the phone. Only you. If the cookies were meant for me and I'd passed them on, guilt twisted in my gut, sharp as a knife. What if I'd eaten them? Would I be the one in that hospital bed, monitors beeping my confusion? I stood, pacing the hallway now, the floor cool under my feet. Memories flooded back, uninvited. Ezra as a teenager, experimenting in the garage with chemistry sets, his notes meticulous, his experiments precise. He'd once made a baking soda volcano that erupted perfectly, but when I suggested adding food coloring for fun, he'd snapped, "It's not about looks, Mom. It's about control." I'd laughed it off, but his eyes had held something cold, calculating. Was this the same? A controlled gesture, laced with intent? The bottle felt heavier in my hand, its plastic unyielding. I carried it to the study, setting it on the desk beside the lamp where the light made the residue shimmer faintly. Dread mounted, a slow build, like pressure in a storm cloud. Ruth's symptoms, vomiting, disorientation, they weren't flu. They screamed something deliberate, toxic. And the cookies, beautiful and handmade, now tainted in my mind. To steady myself, I made tea. The kettle's whistle shrill in the quiet house. The steam rose, fragrant with chamomile, but I didn't drink it, just held the mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. What next? Call Ezra? Confront him? The thought made my stomach churn. His voice from the morning still echoed, bitter and sharp. No, better to wait, gather facts. But waiting felt like surrender, and the unease grew, wrapping around me like fog. I glanced at the fridge, where the single cookie waited in its container, innocent yet ominous. Should I throw it out? Destroy the bottle? Instinct said no, preserve them. Like clues in a puzzle I was only beginning to see. The house creaked around me, settling as evening fell, and I turned on lights one by one, chasing shadows that seemed to linger. Later, after dark, I found myself outside, the night air cool against my skin, pacing the front walkway under the stars. The wind carried a faint scent of cinnamon, or was that memory, conjured from the cookie's imagined taste? My phone buzzed in my pocket, an unknown number. I answered, heart thudding, but it was just a wrong number, a muffled voice apologizing. Still, it rattled me, every sound amplified now. Back inside, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, habits from a life that suddenly felt vulnerable. Sleep evaded me that night, the bed sheets twisting as I tossed, visions of Ruth's pale face blending with Ezra's handwriting on the card. By morning, resolve hardened. I needed answers. I called the lab where Janelle Marora worked. She owed me a favor from years back, when I'd helped her through a rough patch. I need something tested, I said quietly, discreetly. She agreed to meet, no questions yet. As I hung up, the bottle and cookie sat on the desk, waiting like they knew the storm was coming. The lab was tucked behind a medical office complex on the edge of town, the kind of place you'd drive past without noticing unless you were seeking it out, its low buildings blending into the overcast sky. I arrived early, the engine of my car still ticking as it cooled in the parking lot, the bottle and cookie container clutched in a plain paper bag on my lap. Janelle met me at the side door, her lab coat crisp despite the hour, her expression neutral, but curious. She didn't pry much, just raised an eyebrow as I handed over the items. "This the kind of favor I'll regret?" she asked lightly, her voice carrying a hint of the old camaraderie we'd shared years ago. I tried to smile, but it faltered, landing somewhere between weary and forced. "Just tell me what's in it," I said, my words quiet against the hum of distant traffic. She nodded, disappearing inside, the door clicking shut behind her like a period at the end of a sentence I wasn't ready to finish. I waited in the car, the radio off, the windows cracked to let in the morning air thick with the scent of dew on asphalt. My hands were cold, clenched in my lap, as memories crept in uninvited, seeping like water under a doorframe. Ezra at 8, folding napkins at the dinner table with sharp, geometric precision, his small fingers creasing the fabric just so. If I unfolded one to use it, he'd freeze, his eyes narrowing in silent accusation. "It's ruined now," he'd whisper, and I'd apologize, smoothing it back as best I could. At 10, a tantrum over the pantry rearranged by color instead of size, shelves upended, cans rolling across the floor while he screamed about order, about how I'd broken his system. I'd held him then, his body rigid in my arms, whispering that it was okay, that we'd fix it. But even as a child, he stored those moments, filed them away like documents in a drawer, to be pulled out later, sharper with time. Brilliant in school, obedient in public, a model child on paper. Teachers praised his focus, his meticulous homework, but at home, the watchfulness emerged. The way he'd observe people eating, his gaze lingering on bites taken, swallows made. Me especially. That time I baked cookies with walnuts by mistake. He'd taken one, chewed, then spat it into the trash, scrubbing his mouth with a napkin until his lips bled raw. "You knew I hate nuts," he'd accused, his voice steady, but eyes blazing. I dismissed it as sensitivity, allergies maybe, but now, in the stark light of suspicion, it felt premeditated, a rehearsal for control. He went still when disappointed, not explosive like other kids, but inward, calculating, like a spring coiling tighter. The nurse from the hospital called mid-morning as I sat there, her voice efficient over the line. Ruth's condition hadn't improved, escalating to internal medicine, still no diagnosis. No mention of the cookies, and I didn't offer it. The words stuck in my throat like dry crumbs. The waiting dragged, the car's interior warming as the sun climbed, beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I wiped them away, my mind turning over the bottle's mystery. White powder, unlabeled, discarded in my trash like an afterthought. Had Ezra slipped it in the package? Or was it coincidence, a remnant from something else? Doubt warred with instinct. Motherhood taught you to defend, to excuse, but survival whispered otherwise. What if the cookies were laced, a sweet trap meant for me? The card's words mocked now. Let's start over. Perhaps a cruel irony, a fresh beginning laced with finality. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the headrest, the upholstery warm and slightly sticky. Ezra had always played the long game, holding slights like treasures. A forgotten birthday card at 16, and months later, my favorite vase shattered. Accidentally, during a cleaning spree. Slipped, he'd said, his smile too even. Janelle's call came just after noon, jolting me from the haze. "It's me," she said, her tone measured, professional. We ran the standard panels, then went deeper. I held my breath, the phone pressed tight to my ear. "There's something in the cookie, traces of a compound related to a condom, monkshood, highly toxic, rare in food. Definitely not accidental." The words landed heavy. Confirmation of the dread I'd carried since Laya's call. Monkshood, poisonous plant, blue flowers like the icing on some cookies. My stomach twisted, bile rising. "You said someone ate these?" Janelle pressed gently. I couldn't answer, the silence stretching. She hesitated. "I'll write it up quietly." We hung up and I sat still, the parking lot blurring through sudden tears. My son had sent me poison, wrapped in ribbon and tissue, disguised as reconciliation. A box I'd passed on like a thoughtless gift, and now Ruth paid the price. Guilt surged, hot and unrelenting. Had I suspected deep down? The saved cookie, a whim turned lifesaver. Driving home, the road blurred with unshed tears, the wheels slick under my palms. The house waited, quiet as ever, but entering felt different, like crossing a threshold into betrayal's territory. I placed the report Janelle had emailed, discreet as promised, on the desk beside the empty bottle, its residue now sinister under the lamp. Monkshood. I'd looked it up on my phone while waiting. Symptoms matching Ruth's. Nausea, confusion, worse if untreated. Ezra's childhood fascination with plants resurfaced in my mind. A herb garden he'd tended at 12, labeling each with scientific names, warning me not to touch certain leaves. "They're dangerous, Mom," he'd said proudly, his eyes gleaming. Had he learned then? Experimented? The pieces fit too neatly, a puzzle I'd ignored for years. Particular sensitive, euphemisms for something darker, resentments nurtured like those plants. Afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I made tea I didn't drink, the mug cooling on the counter as I paced, the floorboards groaning in rhythm. What now? Confront him? The phone tempted, but fear held me back, his voice, that crack of panic. No, evidence first. But the emotional weight pressed, a mother's denial crumbling under facts. He'd planned this, held the grudge through years of silence, sharpened it into something lethal. I sat at the kitchen table, folding my hands, staring at the empty spot where the box had been. The house listened, creaking softly as if sharing my secret. By evening, resolve formed, I couldn't ignore it. The poison was real, the intent clear. Tomorrow, authorities. But tonight, the dread lingered, cold as the untouched tea. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky pressing low like a lid on my unease, rain pattering softly against the windows as I brewed coffee stronger than usual. The report from Janelle lay on the kitchen table, its printed words stark, monkshood, toxic, intentional, and beside it, the empty bottle with its ghostly powder residue, both staring back like accusations I couldn't ignore. Sleep had been fleeting, fragmented with dreams of blue-iced cookies crumbling to dust, Ezra's face flickering in the shadows, his eyes holding that old, stored resentment. I sipped the coffee, bitter and hot, scalding my tongue but grounding me in the moment. What mother reports her son to the police? The question looped in my mind, a tether pulling me between loyalty and self-preservation. But Ruth lingered in my thoughts too, her kindness, now repaid with hospital beds and unanswered tests. If the poison was meant for me, and I deflected it unwittingly, how could I stay silent? The house felt smaller, its walls closing in with the weight of decision. I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse that felt armor-like, its fabric crisp against my skin, and gathered the evidence into a plain envelope, the cookie in its container, the bottle, Janelle's report folded neatly. The drive to the station was short, rain slicking the roads, wipers swishing rhythmically like a heartbeat out of sync. The building loomed modest, tucked at the town's edge, its bricks weathered but solid. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and paper, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I asked for Detective Fallon Reyes, my voice steadier than my trembling hands. He appeared promptly, mid-30s with sharp eyes that scanned without resting, his handshake firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Greaves?" he said, leading me to a small office in the back. Nothing dramatic, just a desk cluttered with files, a chair that squeaked as I sat. He offered water. I declined, my throat too tight anyway. We started slow, his questions gentle at first, probing the surface like testing ice. How long had I been estranged from Ezra? 3 years, I explained, the words spilling out measured, detailing the silence that had built like a wall. No calls, no visits, until the package arrived. He jotted notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching softly. When did I receive it? What did it contain? I described the box, the ribbon, the cookie's careful beauty, the card's blue ink promise. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened when I mentioned giving them to Ruth, her collapse, Laya's call. "And you suspect the cookies?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. I nodded, pulling out the envelope, sliding it across the desk. I had one tested, monkshood, poison. The word hung there, heavy, irrevocable. He opened the report, scanning it, then examined the bottle under the desk lamp, its residue faint but damning. The harder questions came next, digging deeper, unearthing the raw edges I'd buried. "Do you believe your son meant to harm you?" I looked down at my hands, twisting the tissue I'd unconsciously pulled from my pocket, its fibers soft and fraying. "I don't want to," I admitted, my voice small in the room's confines. "But the evidence, Ruth didn't bake them." "I didn't. He sent them. And the bottle, it wasn't mine, the timing fits." Reyes nodded, his pen pausing. "Any reason? Financial? Family tension?" I flinched, the words stirring old wounds. "He resents me, always has, I think. Blames me for things, small slights, forgotten promises. I couldn't fix what he saw as broken." Memories flashed. Ezra at 17, accusing me of favoring my sister during her illness, his voice cold as he packed for college, leaving without a backward glance. I'd called it independence then, now it felt like rehearsal for abandonment. Reyes listened without interrupting, his doubts subtle, swimming in the space between his brows. All I had was poison and intuition. No prints, no witnesses, no confession, but he leaned in, professional empathy in his tone. "Would you submit these as evidence? Let us open a formal case?" I hesitated, the betrayal sharp as a blade, even knowing Ezra had struck first. Motherhood didn't dissolve with age, it lingered, a thread pulling tight. "Yes," I said finally, the word escaping like a sigh. "If he's done this before, or might again, I can't ignore it." He nodded, standing to signal the end, his chair scraping back. "We'll log them and keep you informed. Call if anything changes." Walking out, the rain had stopped, the sky lightening to a pale gray, but I locked the car doors out of habit, hands gripping the wheel white-knuckled. It wasn't guilt exactly. Deeper, older, the ache of raising a boy who became a stranger, his quirks twisting into malice. The drive home blurred, streets familiar yet distant, my mind replaying the interview like a loop. Had I said enough? Too much? The envelope was gone, evidence in official hands, but the weight remained, pressing on my chest. Back home, the house greeted me with silence. The kitchen table empty now, its surface polished but scarred with faint rings from years of mugs. I made lunch I didn't eat, the sandwich dry in my mouth, thoughts churning. What if they found nothing? Dismissed it as coincidence, but the monkshood was real, Ruth's suffering tangible. I paced the living room, dust motes swirling in the afternoon light, and called the hospital for an update. Ruth stable but weak, tests ongoing. Laya's voice trembled on the line, grateful for my concern, unaware of the report I'd filed. Hanging up, isolation wrapped tighter, a cocoon of secrets. Evening fell slow, shadows lengthening, and I sat with a book unopened, the pages a blur. The decision to involve authorities felt permanent, a line crossed but necessary, like pruning a poisoned branch to save the tree. Yet doubt whispered, was I the poison, misunderstanding him all along? Sleep came late, fitful, the hall light on against the dark. By morning, a new resolve stirred. I couldn't wait passively. If evidence was thin, I'd gather more. The recorder in my drawer, small and discreet, caught my eye. Confrontation loomed, risky but essential. The emotional toll mounted, a quiet erosion, but ignoring it meant surrender. I owed Ruth, owed myself, the truth. That night, I didn't sleep much. The couch cushions shifting under me as I dozed fitfully with the hall light on, the phone clutched like a lifeline beside me. Every creak in the house jolted me awake, ears straining into the darkness, imagining footsteps on the porch or a knock that never came. By morning, the decision solidified. I would go see Ezra. Not as the mother pleading for reconciliation, but as the woman he'd underestimated, armed with questions, and a small recorder tucked in my coat pocket. The device was simple, bought years ago for dictation during my volunteer work, its battery fresh and ready. I tested it in the kitchen, my voice low as I whispered the date and time, the tiny red light blinking assurance. Breakfast was coffee only, black and strong, the mug's heat steadying my hands as I rehearsed what to say. Words careful like steps on thin ice. Confrontation carried risks, but passivity meant living in shadows, and I'd done enough of that. The drive to Ezra's house felt longer than the miles suggested, the road winding through suburbs where lawns were greener than mine, houses neat with fresh paint. His place was modest, a split level with a manicured garden, precise like him. The flowers aligned in rows that spoke of control rather than joy. I parked curbside, heart thudding deep and steady, and slipped the recorder on before knocking. Its hum inaudible against the coat's fabric. He answered quickly, his tight smile not reaching his eyes, looking thinner than I remembered, hollowed out like something inside had been eroding slowly. "Mom," he said, stepping aside with a gesture that felt rehearsed. "This is a surprise." I forced a smile, keeping my tone light, neutral. "I heard about Ruth. Wanted to check in, see how she's doing." He nodded, ushering me in, the door clicking shut behind us, with a finality that raised the hairs on my neck. The living room was spotless, bookshelves aligned by height, not a speck of dust on the coffee table. His domain, ordered to perfection. We moved to the kitchen, where sunlight streamed through windows overlooking the backyard, a knife block angled just so on the counter. "She's still at St. Luke's," he said, pouring water into glasses without asking. "Laya's with her. They think it's some virus." I nodded, accepting the glass, the cool liquid sliding down my throat as I watched his face for cracks. "I'm sorry we didn't get to talk more the other day," I said casually, setting the glass down. "The cookies were lovely." He raised an eyebrow, his movements fluid but tense. "Were they?" The recorder captured it all, silent witness in my pocket. I studied him, choosing my words like ingredients in a recipe. "I didn't try them, actually." Ruth was thrilled. She said the star-shaped one was her favorite. There it was, the flicker, brief as a shadow crossing light. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, a pause barely noticeable, but enough to confirm the unease churning in my gut. "Ruth picked the stars," he murmured, his voice softening, almost reflective. My breath caught. I hadn't specified the shape she'd mentioned, only implied her delight. He'd slipped, revealing knowledge he shouldn't have unless he'd known which ones were laced, or imagined her choice in his careful planning. He turned to the sink, rinsing a glass that looked clean already, the water running steady. She always did go for anything pretty, more concerned with aesthetics than what's underneath. The words carried an edge, disdain veiled as observation. I pressed gently, heart pounding louder now. You never told me you'd started baking. He laughed, but it rang off-key, forced. New hobby, good way to unwind. The air thickened, charged with unspoken tension, the kitchen's spotlessness feeling oppressive, like a stage set for deception. I shifted, my coat brushing the counter, and asked, Where'd you learn to use monkshood? He froze. Not dramatically, but a stillness in his spine, a calculation clicking into place. The glass paused mid-rinse, water dripping. I don't know what that is, he said too quickly, setting it down with deliberate care. Dr. Marrero does, I replied quietly. She ran the test. It was in the cookie. He turned then, the glass forgotten, his face composed but eyes shifting, a flicker of assessment. You went to Janelle. It wasn't a question. Ezra, I don't know what you think you're doing, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor inside. But accusations like that, they don't end well, especially without proof. I think you've already given me enough, I whispered. You slipped up. He stared for a long moment, his expression unmoving, but behind it, something stirred. Calculation, perhaps regret, or the cold precision I'd seen in his childhood tantrums. You've always misunderstood me, he said finally, his tone flat, almost weary. No, I countered softly. I think I finally understand you completely. I reached for my purse, hand steady by will alone, my heart thudding so fiercely I feared he'd hear it. As I turned to leave, my gaze caught the counter behind him. There, half hidden under a tea towel, another small bottle, identical to the one from my trash, its shape unmistakable. He noticed my glance, shifting casually to block it, as if stretching after a long sit. I should go, I said, voice light but edged. I've already taken up enough of your time. Give Ruth my best, he replied, his smile returning, too smooth, voice airy again. Stepping outside, the cold air hit like relief, nerves electric as I walked to the car, doors locking with a click before I stopped the recorder. My hands shook as I played it back briefly, his words clear. Ruth picked the stars. A damning admission. I sent the audio to Detective Reyes from the driveway, fingers flying over the phone before doubt could intervene. Then I drove straight to St. Luke's, the sun dipping low, casting elongated shadows that mirrored the lengthening dread. Ruth was unconscious still, Laya at her bedside, eyes red-rimmed. I told her everything, the test, the visit, the slip. Words tumbling out in a rush, her face paling as truth settled. By the time I left, night had fallen heavy. The sky starless, home felt fragile, locks checked thrice, but the confrontation lingered, a victory laced with sorrow. The boy I'd raised, now unmasked. Detective Reyes called just after sunrise, his voice cutting through the haze of my restless night like a beam through fog, the phone vibrating on the couch where I'd finally dozed. The audio had been enough, he said, coupled with the toxicology results from Ruth's blood work, which mirrored the monkshood in the cookie. It secured the warrant they needed. Ezra was taken in before noon, quiet and composed, as if he'd rehearsed the moment in front of a mirror, his precision extending even to his downfall. I didn't go to the station. There was nothing left to say, no words that could bridge the chasm he'd carved with his careful baking and hidden poisons. Instead, I sat in the kitchen. The morning light, filtering through the curtains in soft shafts, dust motes swirling lazily as I stared at the empty table, the spot where the box had first appeared, now a void, echoing with what-ifs. Ruth woke slowly over the next few days, her confusion lifting like mist burning off a lake, replaced by gratitude that shone in her eyes when I visited. I sat with her when Laya couldn't, holding her hand in the sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and wilting flowers, the monitors beeping a steady rhythm of recovery. She didn't ask for details at first, her voice weak but warm, thanking me for the company, for the small comforts like fresh water or adjusting her pillows. When she did inquire gently about the cookies and what had happened, I told her the truth in measured tones, the poison, Ezra's intent, the arrest. Watching her face pale but then harden with a resolve I recognized as survival. I'm sorry, I said one afternoon, squeezing her hand once, the skin papery under my fingers. She squeezed back a silent acknowledgement that was enough, a bridge over the shared betrayal, without need for more words. Laya came to my kitchen later that week, her eyes red from crying, collapsing into a chair as I poured tea that steamed faintly in the cool air. She spoke in fragments at first, her voice breaking, saying she should have known that Ezra had grown distant, strange in ways she'd dismissed as stress. She'd found notations in his journals, sketches of plants, extraction methods, dosages calculated with his blueprint precision, and jars of dried herbs tucked in the garage, labels in his neat handwriting that she hadn't recognized. "I thought it was a hobby," she whispered, stirring her tea without drinking. "Coping, maybe." But the police had uncovered more. Ezra, writing under a false name on obscure herbalist forums for years, posts academic in tone but chilling in hindsight, discussions of aconitum properties, interactions with sugars, subtle ways to mask bitterness. Terminology matched Ruth's blood work exactly, threads leading back to his resentment, perhaps deeper than I'd imagined, festering like roots underground. It all traced to one choice, that single cookie I hadn't eaten, saved on a whim, that now felt like fate's quiet nudge. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I took the container from the fridge, the cookie still intact though its frosting had dulled, sugar crystals no longer sparkling but matte, like faded stars. Detective Reyes had returned it in a sealed evidence bag the day of the arrest, handing it over with a nod. "Not for revenge," he'd said, "but for clarity." I slid it into the bag, pressing the seal shut with a click that echoed in the empty kitchen, the plastic heavier than its contents warranted. That night, I cleared a small fireproof box from the hall closet, dust puffing as I opened it, and placed the cookie inside. Alongside went the card, its blue ink promise now a grim relic. "Happy birthday, Mom. Let's start over." I locked it with a twist of the key, the metal cold, and shelved it high, out of daily sight but not forgotten. A reminder of what I'd almost missed, the sweetness that hid venom. Standing in the kitchen a long time after, the house quiet around me, the air still and heavy with evening's approach, I turned off the light and walked down the hall. The floorboards creaked softly, familiar now rather than ominous, but uncertainty lingered like a scent in the air. Whether to feel safe again, or if safety had ever truly been mine. Betrayal by blood cuts deepest, a wound that scars over but aches in the rain, and motherhood's ties, once unbreakable, now frayed to threads. Ezra's arrest closed a chapter, but the story echoed on, whispers of resentment I'd nurtured unknowingly. At 63, I'd learned that starting over wasn't always a gift. Sometimes it was a trap, ribbon-wrapped and waiting. The porch swing creaked outside, empty in the night, and I lay awake, listening to the house settle, wondering if peace would ever fully return, or if shadows would always lurk in the corners. In the quiet days that followed, as the town whispered about the arrest and Ruth's slow mending, I found myself lingering more on the porch, the swing's gentle sway, a rhythm that soothed the edges of my frayed thoughts. Letting the world soften around me like sunlight filtering through leaves on a calm afternoon. The lawn, stubborn as ever, began to show faint hints of green where I'd watered it patiently. A small victory in the midst of larger uncertainties. Reminding me that healing comes not in grand gestures, but in the steady drip of time and care. Ruth visited once she was stronger, her steps tentative but her smile warm, and we shared tea in the kitchen, speaking less of the poison and more of the simple joys. The wind chime's melody, the taste of fresh-baked bread without hidden dangers, rebuilding a bond that had bent but not broken under the weight of what had happened. Laya, too, reached out in her own way. Her calls growing longer, laced with shared reflections on the man we'd both loved in different measures. Finding solace in the understanding that some darknesses hide even from those closest, yet light persists in the connections we choose to nurture. As weeks turned to months, the locked box on the shelf gathered a thin layer of dust, its contents a quiet sentinel rather than a haunting presence, allowing me to breathe easier in the routines I'd reclaimed, the crossword's familiar grid, the coffee's bitter warmth at dawn. Betrayal had carved its mark, deep and indelible, but in its wake came a clearer sight, appreciation for the fragile piece of solitude and the strength woven from survival's threads. And so, as the seasons shifted softly onward, I whispered to the empty rooms a gentle affirmation, that safety, though once shattered, could be pieced together anew, fading into the hush of evening like a sigh carried on the breeze.